In this course, we're going to be looking at which groups of people are at higher risk for suicide. We'll be using data from the CDC. We know that suicide and suicide attempts are very pressing and serious public health challenges, the effects of which can have emotional, mental, physical, and even long-term economic consequences. So what are the conditions that can influence suicide and suicidal ideation? Well, they can be influenced by the conditions in which people live, play, work, and learn. These conditions are also known as the social determinants of health. These social determinants can include racism and discrimination in our society, any kind of economic hardship. These hardships can mean high unemployment, poverty, limited affordable housing. Other social determinants can be lack of educational opportunities, barriers to physical and mental health care access. Additional factors that can increase suicide risk include relationship problems or the feeling of a lack of connectedness to others. Other factors that can increase suicidal risk are having easy access to lethal means, experiences of violence like child abuse and neglect, and other childhood experiences such as bullying. These are some groups that experience more negative conditions, such as the ones I just mentioned, and these groups have higher rates of suicide or suicide attempts than the general population. These excess burdens of suicide in some populations are called health disparities. We are focusing in these courses on suicide among the elderly. Other groups experiencing suicide health disparities include veterans, rural Americans, people of color, and tribal populations. While we are concentrating on seniors in this course, it is important to get a better understanding of other disparities in suicide to be able to see the full scope of the issue. So let's look at age. We will begin with adults. These adults who are aged 35 to 64 years account for 46.8% of all suicides in the US, and suicide is the 8th leading cause of death for this age group. Among men in this age group, suicide rates were highest for non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaskan Native men, followed by non-Hispanic white men. Among women in this age group, suicide rates were highest among non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaska Native women and non-Hispanic white women. Adults aged 75 and older have one of the highest suicide rates. The CDC estimates the rate of 20.3 per 100,000 men aged 75 and older have the highest rate. That rate is estimated at 42.2 per 100,000 compared to other age groups. Non-Hispanic white men have the highest suicide rate compared to other racial or ethnic men in this age group. Now let's look at youth and young adults. Youth and young adults ages 10 to 24 account for 15% of all suicides. The suicide rate for this group is lower than other age groups, 11 per 100,000. However, suicide is the second leading cause of death for this age group. Youth and young adults most impacted include non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaska Native, with a suicide rate of 36.3 per 100,000. Youth and young adults have high rates of emergency department visits for self-harm. Girls and young women are at particularly high risk, with their emergency department visit rate being approximately twice the rate of emergency department visits among boys and young men. In 2021, 9% of high school students reported attempting suicide during the previous 12 months. Suicide attempts were reported most frequently among girls compared to boys. While boys have fewer attempts, they are more likely to die due to using more lethal means, such as firearms. I want to now touch briefly on other groups facing disparities in suicide. Suicide risk is higher among people who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. The CDC has limited data on the rate of suicide among people who identify as sexual minorities. But the research does show that high school students who identify as sexual minorities have higher rates of suicide attempts as compared to heterosexual students. For example, in 2021, more than a quarter of high school students identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual reported attempting suicide in the prior 12 months. This rate was 5 times higher than the rate reported among heterosexual students. Now let's look at veterans. In 2020, 6,146 veterans died by suicide, according to the CDC. Suicide was the 13th leading cause of death among veterans overall, and the second leading cause of death among veterans under the age of 45. Veterans have an adjusted suicide rate that is 57.3% greater than non-veteran U.S. adult population. Veterans account for about 13.9% of suicides among adults in the U.S. Suicide rates by race and ethnicity will be looked at now. Age-adjusted suicide rates are highest among non-Hispanic, American Indian, and Alaska Native and non-Hispanic white people. Suicide is the 9th leading cause of death among non-Hispanic, American Indian, and Alaska Native people. Suicide is the 11th leading cause of death for both Hispanic and non-Hispanic people of all races. Between 2018 and 2021, suicide rates significantly increased overall among non-Hispanic people of all races. Between 2018 and 2021, suicide rates significantly increased overall among non-Hispanic American Indian, Alaska Native, and non-Hispanic Black people, and declined by 3.9% among non-Hispanic white people. Suicide ideation is higher among people with disabilities. The CDC has limited data available on suicide among people with disabilities. However, a survey highlighted that in 2021, adults with disabilities were 3 times more likely to report suicidal ideation compared to people without disabilities. Prior research also showed that the prevalence of reported mental distress, which is a risk factor for suicide, was 4.6 times higher among people with disabilities than among people without disabilities. Suicide rates by industry or occupation. For some definitions, industry is the type of activity at a person's workplace, and occupation is the kind of work a person does to earn a living. A CDC study examining data in 32 states found that the suicide rate among workers, certain industries, and occupations was significantly greater than the general U.S. populations, particularly for males. The industry groups that had the highest suicide rates were mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction, males 54.2 per 100,000. Construction, males 45.3 per 100,000. Other services, such as automotive repair, males 39.1 per 100,000. Agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, males 36.1 per 100,000. Transportation and warehousing, males 29.8 per 100,000, females 10.1 per 100,000. The occupation groups that had higher suicide rates than the general population were construction and extraction, males 49.4 per 100,000, females 25.5 per 100,000. Installation, maintenance, and repair, males 36.9 per 100,000. Arts, design, entertainment, sports, and media, males 32 per 100,000. Transportation and material moving, males 30.4 per 100,000, females 12.4 per 100,000. Protective service, females 14 per 100,000. Healthcare support, females 10.6 per 100,000. Suicide rates differ based on where you live. The CDC says that suicide rate increases as population density decreases and an area becomes more rural. 2021, suicide rates based on population density. Large central metropolitan, 11.6 per 100,000. Large fringe metro, 12.8 per 100,000. Medium metro, 15.7 per 100,000. Small metro, 17.8 per 100,000. Micropolitan, non-metro, 19.2 per 100,000. Non-core, non-metro, 21.7 per 100,000. Suicide rates in rural, non-metro areas are highest among non-Hispanic, American Indian, and Alaska Native males, 61.8 per 100,000, and non-Hispanic white males, 36.8 per 100,000.